Before we really get into this video, I just want to say that I actually started writing the script for this quite a long time ago, and I've had to make adjustments to it. Hopefully it doesn't really affect the quality of the video nor the research that I've put into it, and I hope you still enjoy it. Now let's get on with the video. Also, I know this is where people will be like, don't forget to like, subscribe, and blah blah blah. But you know what? I'd really rather you watch the entire video and then decide whether this was worth subscribing for. And if you want more content like this, then I would appreciate the comments down below letting me know. Now the 9th generation of consoles has been released with the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series S and Series X consoles, with their overall power being magnitudes higher than the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 generation. Gamers are going to be expecting bigger and better things from this new generation of consoles. For some, it's going to be the push for higher resolution. For others, it will be the ability to play games at a higher frame rate. Some will be looking forward to ray tracing in games, and for some it might be the reduction in load times that have plagued consoles since the introduction of games on optical media as the main game format back in the days of Sega CD, Sega Saturn, and the original PlayStation. The use of fast PCIe 4.0 NVMe SSD drives in the PS5 and the Xbox Series consoles is going to be a huge help in the load times. While these drives won't completely eliminate load times, they will reduce load times considerably for games made with these drives in mind. A good example of this is Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales on the PS5, which can load from a fresh startup of the game to entering the game in around 6 seconds, which is extremely fast. There's also Microsoft's Quick Resume for their Xbox series of consoles as another example. However, it should be noted that the SSD drives can't really do much of anything for the resolutions or frame rates in the games that will be coming out. They may help for the slight stutters that can happen in open world games as new areas load in, but that's about it. Resolution is going to be affected by the GPU, and the frame rates are through a mix of the CPU and the GPU. At lower resolutions, the CPU can become the limiting factor in frame rates, if the GPU is more than powerful enough to run the games at that higher frame rate at that resolution. At higher resolutions, the GPU becomes the limiting factor for frame rates. This is true for both consoles and PCs, as even only the newest GPUs from both NVIDIA and AMD are finally capable of native 4K resolutions at 60 frames per second or higher in newer games at high settings consistently. Even the mid-generation refresh consoles, the Xbox One X and the PlayStation 4 Pro, had these issues, mostly due to their underpowered CPUs, but also because of the older GCN architecture GPUs from AMD that they used. Because they used underpowered CPU architecture from the beginning of the generation, most games for the entirety of the PS4 and Xbox One generation were limited to 30 frames per second. And even then, they didn't always hit that target, even if their GPUs could hit the targeted resolution of the games on the base and enhanced consoles. This led developers to use techniques like dynamic resolution scaling or reconstructions of the image, like with checkerboard rendering, to up the native resolution to a higher resolution display while trying to maintain at least consistent frame rates. Some did balk at these types of techniques being used, but the truth of the matter is they not only helped games hit more consistent frame rates, but there were many times that the average consumer couldn't even tell the difference between reconstructed image and a native resolution, nor see when the resolution changed. In fact, I'd say the vast majority of people who bought games could barely tell if a game had dynamic resolution scaling or reconstruction. Unless someone is an absolute videophile, the difference between reconstructed images and native resolution are extremely hard to see. It's not that they're not visible, but most people won't really notice them, especially in motion. Which brings us to the newest generation of consoles and PC graphics cards. Even though the PS5 and Xbox Series consoles, especially the Series X compared to the base Xbox One, are far more capable machines than even their mid-generation refresh predecessors, especially because their CPUs are much better than the CPUs of the last generation consoles, we're still seeing things in the first round of games like dynamic resolution scaling to try and keep frame rate targets. As I said though, most people won't notice the resolution scaling during gameplay, unless it drops to an exceptionally low resolution where the difference is hard to miss. And even with dynamic resolution scaling, frame rates aren't always being maintained right now. Does this mean that the new consoles are underpowered? For consoles, no. If you compare them to PC gaming, they're at least 2 generations behind though. The CPUs and GPUs in the newer consoles are capable of doing both high resolutions and high frame rates, but what many seem to forget is that attempting to push out a native 4K resolution is extremely difficult even on powerful GPUs. The difference between 1080p resolution and 4K resolution is near 4 times the increase in the amount of pixels being pushed to the display. That's over 8 million pixels at 4K resolution. Adding in textures, lighting effects, etc., that becomes extremely taxing even on high-end PC graphics cards before the RTX 4090. Even before real-time ray tracing is factored in, which dramatically decreases performance across all platforms. Then there is also how often new frames need to be drawn for specific frame rates. At 30 FPS, a new frame has to be drawn every 33.33 milliseconds, while 60 frames per second needs to have a new frame be drawn every 16.66 milliseconds. And 120 frames per second needs to have a new frame drawn every 8.33 milliseconds. These draw calls are a mix of the CPU and GPU performance, where a bottleneck on either one can cause a lower frame rate. Generally, at lower resolution, drops in frame rates are because the CPU is causing a bottleneck, while at higher resolutions it is the GPU that is the limiting factor. The solution to help get both high visual fidelity and high consistent frame rates is one that has already been implemented on the enhanced consoles of last generation and on PC graphics cards: reconstruction techniques. On the enhanced last-gen consoles, this was mostly done through what is known as checkerboard rendering, and on the RTX and 20 higher series graphics cards, NVIDIA's proprietary deep learning supersampling, otherwise known as DLSS, can be employed. By using these reconstruction techniques, the GPU can render the game at a lower internal resolution, while pushing out a higher resolution final image to the screen. To the untrained eye, i.e. the average consumer, you or me, the difference between the reconstructed image and native resolution image is almost imperceptible. You'd need to be someone like the folks at Digital Foundry to reliably spot the differences between a reconstructed image and a native resolution image, especially in motion and from an average viewing distance in, say, a living room or other non-PC desk space used for gaming, where the viewer is on average at least 6 feet from the screen. The PS4 Pro uses checkerboard rendering to achieve most of its 4K output visuals, with only a few exceptions being native 4K resolution, but it could also utilize native resolutions generally around 1440p and dynamic resolution scaling as well. The Xbox One X could also use similar methods if developers wanted to use them, but more often tried to go in for as close to a native 4K resolution as possible, either trying for native 4K, 1800p, or 1720p resolutions, and to use dynamic resolution scaling to keep the frame rates more consistent. Both consoles can then upscale the final image to 4K for displays that can handle that resolution. There are, as one can guess, benefits and drawbacks to both methods. The bigger innovation, however, is the new super sampling techniques being developed by NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, and also Microsoft. Now, while most of the time super sampling is a term used to mean an image is being rendered at a higher resolution and then downsampled to a lower resolution output to help with anti-aliasing, these newer super sampling methods are actually being used to take lower resolution images and then upscale them to a higher resolution, while trying to maintain a quality of visual fidelity found in the higher resolution image. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but the way these new super sampling methods work for Intel and NVIDIA is to use traditional super sampling first, using the high resolution image as a reference for a lower resolution image, and then upscale the lower resolution image. It's actually a fairly complicated initial process, and I won't claim to know everything about the methods utilized, but I can give a basic breakdown based on NVIDIA's DLSS technology. NVIDIA has developers submit thousands upon thousands of images and sequences of games in motion at a very high resolution, normally 8K or even 12 or 16K. NVIDIA then utilizes their own supercomputers consisting of thousands of high-end GPUs and CPUs to analyze the images. Then, through machine learning, these supercomputers take aspects of those super high-resolution source files, learn what the high-resolution image is supposed to look like, and then interpolate what it knows to the image to look like onto a lower-resolution file, typically 1080p or 1440p. Then the algorithm attempts to replace lower-resolution textures and other visual aspects of the file, and then upsample the image from the native resolution to the higher resolution. all in real time. The end effect is supposed to allow the GPU to render the native image at a lower resolution, apply the improvements from DLSS, and then upsample the image to a higher resolution as it gets to the display, allowing for the game to look better than its native internal resolution while also getting higher and more consistent frame rates. The general goal of this, as of now, is to get more games to output a 4K image while maintaining at least 60 frames per second. I should also mention that DLSS only works on graphics cards with NVIDIA's Tensor cores, so only the RTX 20 series and higher can perform it. DLSS will not work on older NVIDIA cards, nor will it work on any card by AMD or Intel. Now, it should be noted that the initial version of DLSS didn't have as big of an impact on game performance or visual fidelity as many hoped. In many cases, the images were looking slightly better than their native resolution, but not by a huge amount, and they only offered a modest increase of between 5 to 15 frames per second, depending on the game. While the original implementation of DLSS wasn't as impressive as people had hoped, NVIDIA actually made great strides with the entire process for DLSS 2.0, which offers a much higher performance and visual fidelity boost than the original implementation. NVIDIA has also improved their Tensor Core technology for the RTX 30 series and higher cards, which allows them to take much better advantage of DLSS 2.0 than the RTX 20 series of cards. NVIDIA's CEO Jensen Huang has made bold claims that utilizing DLSS 2.0 in quality mode on RTX 30 and higher cards outputs graphics that are much better looking and provide a higher frame rate than their native resolution counterparts. This is yet to truly be seen across a wide variety of titles. With the release of the RTX 4090 card, NVIDIA has released DLSS 3.0, which is promising much greater improvements over 2.0, especially for ray trace games. However, DLSS 3.0 is locked behind the 40 series of cards at this time. Also, there are only a handful of games that support 3.0, and its ability to add extra frames in between the rendered frames of the game to increase the smoothness of animations. So, as of the time of this writing, I can't say how well the updated DLSS works, though initial tests are promising in some games, but the amount of titles that utilize DLSS 3.0 is still extremely small. AMD has also released its first two versions of its Fidelity FX Super Resolution, known as FSR. Now, unlike DLSS or Intel's XeSS, FSR is not utilizing any machine learning nor any special hardware. It is just a straight-up upsampling technology. And while FSR 1.0 and 2.0 do increase performance, because it is basically just upsampling, any artifacts from the original resolution image will also show up in the upsampled image. I will note that FSR 2.0 did add temporal aspects, taking data from previous frames when applicable. Currently, very few console games use FSR, with the main ones being Deathloop, Cyberpunk 2077, and the next-gen update of The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, though for the last two they aren't using it for upsampling as much as they are using it as an anti-aliasing technique with mixed results. Microsoft also has their DirectML technology, a machine learning component of DirectX 12 Ultimate that can also apparently be used in conjunction with these super sampling technologies for games that use DirectX 12 Ultimate. The Xbox Series X and the Series S are already confirmed to have support for DirectML, though to date I don't actually know of any games that use DirectML as an upsampling technology. Intel has also just released its first set of mid-range ARC GPUs. Intel has designed a machine learning algorithm with its XeSS technology. However, unlike DLSS, XeSS is said to be able to work on any GPU manufacturer's cards. Even though Intel is using their own machine learning dedicated hardware, they have stated that the XeS technology will work on other GPU manufacturers' hardware, just not as fast as it will on Intel Arc GPUs. So why are these sorts of technologies of benefit to gamers on both consoles and PC? Simple. When they work correctly, they allow the GPU to free up resources otherwise used in rendering high-resolution images to be used for other things, such as improving frame rates. Provided the technologies are working and the CPU can keep up with the draw calls, we should be able to see more and more games have great-looking visuals while getting to at least 60 frames per second. Well, actually, The human eye can't see more than 30 frames per second, so putting anything above that is pointless. No. Just no. Anyone who tells you that the human eye can't see anything above 30 frames per second is one of two things: an intentional liar, or someone who needs additional education on the matter for believing this falsehood that has been perpetuated for years. First of all, the human eye doesn't see in frames per second. Essentially still shots put together quickly to give the appearance of motion. This is how movies, TV, and video games are done. Our eyes do not have shutters like cameras, and our brains see what is happening as a constant stream of information from the light hitting our retinas and the nerves sending signals to the brain. The world isn't moving at 24 or 30 frames per second, and our eyes don't see it like that anyway. Some research has shown that people can discern individual images even when only in front of them for 13.33 milliseconds, or the equivalent of 75 frames per second. And some people can discern individual images in front of them for even shorter times. This is a reason that things like subliminal messages in film are a thing, where one frame out of every 24 frames shown in a second has an image or a message. Your brain recognizes the image or message even though it goes by faster than your conscious self seems to notice. In cases where the filmmaker wants to make people feel squeamish and uneasy, images of brutal things can be exerted, as an example. Or the famous example of Disney's The Lion King, where the stars moving by the screen spelled out the word sex for a single frame before it was found and subsequently removed. Secondly, when we view media at different frame rates, the human eye can definitely tell the difference in the frame rate of the media. Because of the flicker rate of the display, also known as the refresh rate, the human eye can definitely see the difference in frame rate by noticing how smooth the image on the display moves. I can point out some easy non-game examples of this. The first is old MTV Pauly Shore shows where they filmed his segments in some odd low frame rate, probably 15 or 16 frames per second. They looked jittery and actually gave me a headache if I tried to watch them for too long. Yes, I'm that old. The other is Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy, where he filmed them at 48 frames per second, which is twice the normal frame rate of movies. People definitely noticed how, quote, weird, unquote, the film looked in movie theaters that could show the films at that frame rate. The home releases are done in the normal 24 frames per second. Essentially, the movies had an effect similar to the soap opera effect some TVs have when they interpolate 24 or 30 frames per second video up to 60 frames per second. As one can easily see on the screen, the image moving at 60 frames per second is far smoother in motion than the image is moving at 30 or 15 frames per second. So a higher frame rate improves the visual experience of games. Granted, not every game needs to run at 60 frames per second or higher. Turn-based RPGs, card games, or other non-action intensive games don't necessarily need to be at higher frame rates. But for the games where a higher frame rate are a benefit, we definitely want those higher frame rates. Higher frame rates also have an additional benefit, the reduction of input lag. Games running at a higher frame rate not only feel more responsive, they actually are more responsive, due to the lowered time between frame draws. Linus Tech Tips did a video where they sat a professional gamer, Corey from the Washington Justice esports team, Shroud, a former professional Counter-Strike player and a game streamer on Twitch, known for his FPS skills, Mr. Grims, another streamer from Twitch, known for his FPS skills, and fighting game skills back when I used to play him in Killer Instinct. Note, he kicked my ass. Repeatedly. And Paul, from Paul's Hardware, who really does hardware reviews and is not a huge competitive gamer. And had them, and himself, all do tests with Counter-Strike on monitors set to 60 Hz, 144 Hz, and 240 Hz. And use graphics cards that couldn't push out frame rates too overly high for those monitors, as even if the display is set to a specific refresh rate, if the game can still be pushing out much higher FPS than the refresh rate, there is still an input lag advantage. I've linked the entire video in the description, but I'm putting a very relevant part here.
Can you explain to both of us the science behind why those shots looked like they were hitting, but did not register?
Yeah, so at 60 frames in hertz, you're kind of getting delay in two areas. You're getting delay from the game state to what's actually being shown on screen. So the guy's actually in a little bit different spot because the rendering took long enough to reach your monitor. Additionally, your input is also delayed. So when you click, that is going to take a little bit longer time to actually reach the game state. So you're getting kind of latency in both directions.
Another advantage of these reconstruction techniques comes when real-time ray tracing is added into the mix. Real-time ray tracing puts a kibosh on the performance of games. On the NVIDIA RTX 20 series of cards, enabling real-time ray tracing could drop frame rates by more than half, even when only outputting at native 1080p. Games like Battlefield 1 could barely keep their frame rates above 30 FPS at 1080p native resolution if all of the ray tracing effects were set to their highest values, and this was on the RTX 2080 and RTX 2080 Ti cards, the highest end of NVIDIA's RTX 20 series cards. On the new consoles, this is also very apparent. Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales was released able to run in two modes, a 60 FPS mode with no ray tracing, or a 30 FPS mode with ray tracing enabled on the PS5. There is a 60 FPS mode with reduced ray tracing that was added in a patch as well. Enabling the ray tracing just doesn't let them get that smoother 60 FPS because of all the extra computational power being used for the ray tracing. I should note here that AMD GPUs do not have the additional ray tracing cores, or RT cores, that NVIDIA RTX cards have, and instead use part of their normal compute units to work in real-time ray tracing, and that all the new generation consoles are using AMD GPUs. As a result, the performance hit from using real-time ray tracing is actually greater on the AMD RDNA 2 and 3 GPUs at the moment. If you look at any of the benchmarks from review channels like Pulse Hardware, Linus Tech Tips, Gamers Nexus, Bitwit, Hardware Unbox, Jay's 2 Cents, Gamers Nexus, and others, you will see that when ray tracing is enabled on the new RDNA 3 cards, the performance hit is far greater than the hit on the second generation RT cores of the RTX 30 series of cards, or the third generation RT cores on the RTX 40 series. But it is similar to the RTX 20 series cards with performance drops. However, this is to be expected as RDNA 2 was AMD's first foray into trying real-time ray tracing. So as their own technology improves, we should hopefully see better results, though RDNA 3 is not really showing this. So how does ray tracing benefit games? It can actually be done in a multitude of ways. Ray trace lighting can be used to cast more realistic lighting in games, and remove the need to pre-bake lighting into the games. Ray trace shadows can be used to make shadows appear more natural, and to stop the disconnect with objects that can happen in traditional rasterized graphics. Ray trace reflections can be used to show real-time realistic reflections in objects, removing the need for screen space reflections or cube maps. And it can even be used on audio to make sounds appear to be coming from their actual location. How developers utilize real-time ray tracing, and to what degree, is always going to be different. For example, Call of Duty Cold War only uses ray trace lighting and shadows, while Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales and Watch Dogs Legions use real-time ray trace reflections. Every developer can utilize ray tracing for what they are looking for in their games, if they choose to use it at all. Though with how recent the technology for real-time ray tracing is, and its huge hit to performance in its current state, I wouldn't expect developers to try and utilize every aspect of ray tracing for quite a while. I wouldn't really expect the majority of games to even utilize any sort of ray tracing on this generation of consoles overall. There will be some, yes, but the majority? Unless something happens that somehow drastically improves performance while using real-time ray tracing, it still won't be the big thing on this generation of consoles. The overall performance hit is far too high at this point in time. Adding in the reconstruction techniques while using real-time ray tracing can help alleviate some of the performance hits ray tracing incurs. For example, ray tracing a 1080p scene while using a reconstruction to get the scene up to a 4K output would mean that the frame rate hit from the ray tracing would be far less than the frame rate hit when rendering at a native 4K resolution. As to how much of a benefit this combination can provide, well, it's not quite there yet. Even on the RTX 3080 using DLSS 2.0 and RTX effects set to their highest settings on many games, they still can't really get to that 4K output and maintain a steady 60 FPS minimum. While using DLSS 2.0 to output at 1440p with lower ray tracing effects enabled seems to have much better results. So far, only the RTX 4090 seems to be able to reliably perform real-time ray tracing at high resolutions and maintain a higher frame rate. Though I will note that the DLSS 3.0 compatible titles that have been tested on the RTX 4090 have shown massive improvements in frame rates when utilizing ray tracing technology and DLSS 3.0, according to the limited reviews of DLSS 3.0 that are currently out there from independent reviewers. But 3.0 has its own issues as well. I'm going to link in the description a video by Hardware Unboxed where they really go into DLSS 3.0, and it's something far more than I could do. So I would really recommend you guys go check that out. It's a very well done video. Digital Foundry has done a few videos on Remedy's game Control on the PC, because Control has some of the most used and best implementations of real-time ray tracing in a game to date. They've shown that using DLSS 2.0 with all the ray tracing bells and whistles maxed out does improve the game's performance, far better than just using RTX by itself, and also at a much better end result over the original implementation of DLSS. But even so, to really get to a more consistent 60 FPS or higher, some of the ray tracing effects need to be dialed back to lower settings. So what does this mean for gaming going forward? Well, Red Gaming Tech actually released a video very similar to this a few days after I informed a friend that I was going to make this video. And Paul from that channel echoes my feelings, almost entirely. That instead of trying to push out native 4K images, that we should look to the reconstruction techniques to bring out higher quality pixels over just more pixels. Utilizing machine learning to improve textures on lower resolution native images will bring about games still potentially looking better than the native resolution being rendered. A game using textures based on, say, an 8K resolution image, but then scaling down the details to fit on a 1440p image, will still give a better looking texture than the native 1440p image could do. The same for even going to a 4K native image and using an 8K based texture in that image. The texture will look better than the native 4K texture. This sort of thinking has actually been used in games going at least back to the original Gears of War, though not in the exact same implementation. Different types of texture maps were used, even back then, to take a high-quality texture map of an object or character and put it on top of a lower polygon count model, giving the look of a much more detailed object or character while saving GPU resources on rendering out the polygons in the scene. So instead of having to render out a character or object with thousands of polygons, the actual character or object could be made with far fewer polygons and allow the texture to give the illusion of a much higher polygon count. This allowed for the scenes to look extremely detailed and have multiple great-looking characters moving on screen at the same time, without a huge performance drop from the GPU trying to render out as many polygons as possible every frame. However, the final image was still whatever native resolution was intended. These machine learning reconstruction tools take this basic idea to the next level. Have the algorithm learn what objects and characters would look like at extremely high resolutions, and then attempt to give the illusion of that level of fidelity on a much lower resolution native image, and then upsample to the desired output resolution. The benefit of this is less GPU power for rendering the native image, and only a slight use of power to do the reconstruction and upsampling, allowing for higher frame rates, or, more importantly, more consistent frame rates at a higher resolution. Just higher frame rates overall is nice, but what we'd really need are much more consistent frame rates in games. We've all been there when we're in a game and a ton of stuff starts happening. Multiple explosions, maybe tons of small particles, etc., all showing up on the screen, and we watch our frame rates plummet, sometimes down to the single digits per second. The games chug along until whatever is causing the frame rate drop ends, but it is noticeable, sometimes extremely so, and also annoying as hell to have to sit through. Are games going to have consistent frame rates all the time? Probably not. However, most people don't notice a dip of 1 or 2 frames here and there, unless the screen tearing that accompanies them is very apparent due to the frame rate drops persisting over long periods of time. People do notice drops of 10, 20, or 30 frames though. The higher the native resolution of the game, the far more likely one is to experience frame rate drops when compared to the power of the machine they are playing on. Allowing the GPU to render a lower resolution native image can help alleviate these types of frame rate drops. Will it completely solve them? No. But if it lowers the overall amount of bad frame rate drops, then it is beneficial. Granted, there are other ways to help alleviate the jarring nature of bigger frame rate drops as well. AMD's open source FreeSync technology, NVIDIA's proprietary G-Sync technology, and on HDMI 2.1 enabled displays that support it, the generic HDMI 2.1 variable refresh rate technology. These technologies match the display's refresh rate to the frame rate being output by the GPU for every frame. These technologies help to keep the appearance of a smooth gameplay experience and no screen tearing, even if the game is dropping frames. Though it should be noted that the display being used needs to support one or more of these features to take advantage of them, and that G-Sync enabled displays only work when paired with NVIDIA GPUs that supports G-Sync. Console gamers, however, need to really look at the TVs they buy, especially if they are buying TVs specifically for the PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X and Xbox Series S. Obviously, since the consoles use AMD GPUs, they don't support G-Sync, so that extra cost of the G-Sync hardware on the TV should be eliminated from the purchase decision, unless players plan to also be using the TV to play PC games using an NVIDIA GPU. But even the HDMI 2.1 VRR and a TV with FreeSync listed may not be enough. In general, these variable refresh rate technologies only run in a range of frame rates. On TVs, it is generally 48 FPS, sometimes 40 FPS, to 120 FPS, or whatever the max refresh rate of the screen is, up to 120 Hz. This means that if the frame rate drops below the low-end threshold, the technology simply won't account for them. To deal with these drops, and perhaps even to make games that run at 30 frames per second appear smoother in motion on them, this accounts for many backwards compatible games on the newer generation of consoles, the TV also needs to support low frame rate compensation, or LFC. TVs labeled as LFC through HDMI, or that have FreeSync Premium or FreeSync Premium Pro, which give LFC to the TV, are much more rare as of the recording of this video. The Xbox Series S and Series X both support variable refresh rates through HDMI 2.1 and through FreeSync right out of the box. The PS5 recently got a VRR through HDMI 2.1 firmware update, but neither AMD nor Sony have confirmed if the PS5 supports or will ever support FreeSync, even though there's nothing that says it can't based on the GPU of the PS5. But while these technologies exist, getting more consistent frame rates in games will be a benefit to everyone, especially those on displays that don't have the various variable refresh rate technologies, which is most of us who haven't purchased a new TV very recently. So we know that when these machine learning reconstruction technologies work as advertised, they do, in fact, offer up potential for great visual fidelity on our screens, while using less resources drawing the native resolution. And, in some cases, even better looking visuals than the native resolution of the higher output, which can help increase overall frame rates and, more importantly, give us more consistent frame rates in games. But why should we look into these technologies as the future of gaming? There are a few reasons. One reason is a much more of a future-proofing reason, but one that the HDMI 2.1 specification does support, and that is 8K resolution. The HDMI 2.1 spec can support 8K content at 60 frames per second, thanks to its higher bandwidth over previous versions of HDMI. Both the Xbox Series X and the PS5 also say they can output in 8K, though apparently both consoles will require a firmware update to enable this output resolution, which will be coming in the future. This isn't a huge deal at the moment, as 8K TVs are exceptionally expensive, and the amount of true 8K content out there is infinitesimally small. However, Nvidia has also jumped on the 8K bandwagon with the RTX 3090, stating that it was the only graphics card at the time capable of doing native 8K gaming at 60 FPS. At least that was up until their newest 4090 card. Like the jump from 1080p to 4K though, 8K resolution is not merely twice the resolution of 4K. 8K resolution is actually the equivalent of 4 times the resolution of 4K, or outputting approximately 33 million pixels compared to 4K's approximately 8.3 million pixels. Once again, the workload on the GPU to output a native 8K resolution is much higher than the power to output a native 4K resolution. As before, this means pushing out even 60 FPS at native 8K resolution becomes an increasingly difficult task. As available resolutions on displays inevitably go up and the technology to output these resolutions becomes more available, there will be those who want to see their content at those higher and higher resolutions. Unfortunately, the technology of GPUs isn't advancing that fast to be able to allow consumer-grade products at an affordable price to have games come out at 8K or higher resolutions in the near future. The RTX 3090 launched at $1,500 for the Founder Edition, which is more than many non-gamers spend on their entire computer. And the 4090 starts at $1,600 for the Founders Edition. But even for the hardest of the hardcore who are early adopters of technology to improve their gaming, that's a huge chunk of change to spend just on their video card. And to get the best performance from the new RTX 4090, one needs a brand new power supply that supports the ability for the GPU and the power supply to talk to each other to ensure that the best amount of power is being sent to the GPU at any given time. And the only quote affordable unquote PC 8K monitors are between $3,500 and $4,000 right now, while 8K TVs start at over $2,000 for the quote lower end unquote models. While affordable 8K displays and capable GPUs, as well as content made to take advantage of 8K resolution, isn't really something that's going to be on the horizon for a good while, these reconstruction techniques can be used to prepare developers and gamers for their most likely inevitable rise to prominence. When the time comes that 8K is ubiquitous, probably a decade or more in the future, developers can be ready for it while still trying to maintain a level of playability in their games that players expect. Practically no one is going to want to be playing 8K games at subpar frame rates just to be able to say they're playing them in 8K. But unless a massive GPU architecture revolution happens that allows for efficiency and affordability with the ability to produce 8K native resolutions at playable frame rates, then the evolution of these machine learning upsampling technologies is going to be a major factor in how games get developed. And even if that hypothetical revolution in GPU architecture does happen, if the improvements seen between DLSS and DLSS 2.0 continue, if AMD's Fidelity FX Super Resolution, Intel's XeSS, and Microsoft's DirectML improve as time goes on, then the claims of Jensen that the reconstructed images look better than native resolution might become true for far more games. Another reason is that, truthfully, most gamers, even on the PC, simply don't have the hardware that is truly capable of outputting 4K or higher resolutions at a playable frame rate. The highest tier of graphics card on the PC are simply not the majority of gaming cards purchased. Valve's Steam hardware profile numbers show this. The GTX 960 far outsold the GTX 980 and 980 Ti. The GTX 1060 far outsold the GTX 1080 and 1080 Ti. The RTX 2060 far outsold the 2080 and 2080 Super, even if we take out the insane launch price of the 2080 from the equation, and so on. The same goes for AMD cards of the same generations. The mid-range cards end up selling far more units than the top-end versions. Even on the console side, the base PS4 and the Xbox One S kept outselling the PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X after each of those enhanced consoles was released. The majority of gamers either simply can't afford or don't want to spend the money on the premium products, or don't honestly care about the extra performance they are missing out on and just want GPUs or consoles that will play the games they want to play. On the PC side, mid-range cards are the king of sales, and conversely, the moneymakers for AMD and Nvidia for their consumer lineup. The real moneymaker is actually enterprise sales and console production, since the Switch does use Nvidia hardware and Sony and Microsoft use AMD. And on the console side, given the option, most people either stick with or purchase the base model over an enhanced model console. The mid-range PC cards are not meant to really be pushing the envelope on graphics fidelity and resolution. The specs of the RTX 30 show that it is an absolute destroyer of 1080p and a beast at 1440p, but its 4K performance isn't anywhere near the 3080 at 4K, even without DLSS 2.0 enabled on the 3080. Same for the RX 6800 from AMD. It massacres 1080p and is a monster at 1440p, but it doesn't come close to the RX 6900 or 6950 XT in terms of performance at 4K. The same is, truthfully, going to be true for this generation of consoles. At 1080p and 1440p, these things will be absolute animals. Note the PS5 does not support native 1440p resolution right now. But at native 4K, we're going to be seeing the limitations of the hardware come into effect early on. It's not that the consoles are bad, it's just that concessions need to be made in the design process to get these out at an affordable price. The current lowest end RDNA 2 graphics card for PCs, RX 6800, has an MSRP of $580 and has more compute units than either the PS5 or the Xbox Series X. This means that the RX 6800 is actually more powerful than the graphics capability of either console in terms of raw compute power, and it has 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory just for the card itself. The PS5 and Xbox Series X have 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory for their respective entire consoles. So neither the Xbox Series X nor the PS5 will be able to match even a halfway decent PC with an RX 6800 in it. But, since no one wants to buy $1,000 or more consoles, it is concessions like these that have to be made to get these products into the hands of buyers. Yes, there is the console optimization that happens because developers know that every console has the exact same specifications as any other console of that same model, but that can only go so far. The raw horsepower of the consoles will never match a similarly based PC GPUs on even mid-range systems. So using these reconstruction technologies will be a huge help in getting the mid-range PC cards and the consoles to have games outputting at 4K or close to it, and still actually being able to play them at acceptable frame rates. It becomes a win-win for both the manufacturers and their buyers, as even the more affordable hardware can still output great-looking graphics, while not being bank-breaking to the consumers. And, since the mid-range is the moneymaker for PC GPU makers for their consumer-focused market, this helps their bottom line as well. Granted, on the console side, the consoles are either loss leaders or break even at their initial launch. The console makers get their profits from game sales and other services that they charge for. But even for a company as cash-rich as Microsoft, there's only so much they're willing to lose on hardware before they decide it's no longer worth producing it. In conclusion, as these upsampling technologies keep improving, I see only benefits for customers, game makers, and the GPU manufacturers. Customers can get great-looking games at higher, more consistent frame rates from game makers, with the vast majority of them never even noticing the artifacts from the upsampling technologies. Game makers can implement these technologies to try and support as many different GPUs as possible, and these are getting easier and easier to implement for the game makers. And the GPU manufacturers can sell their ultra high-end GPUs to those who want them, while still being able to give the majority of the gamers who buy mid-range GPUs a great experience. Everybody wins in the end. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video. If you liked it, please hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button. Either way, I'm good. Also, if you enjoyed the video and wish to help support in making more, consider visiting my Patreon page located in the description below. And again, thank you very much.